Good morning. Today we're going to do a review on the Century Arms Canik or Canik TP9SFX. It's a 5¼ inch barrel, 9mm long slide. You can see it's unloaded, and we'll go ahead and get the review started. I haven't shot the pistol yet. I'm going to do that on film this morning, and I just wanted to cover a few of the details of it. I'm going to try and make this a very detailed review to hopefully answer some questions those of you might have that aren't familiar with the pistol, that want to compare it to, say, a Glock. So a lot of my references will be aimed towards Glock because the firing mechanism is very similar to that. So first of all, to break it down, double check the chamber, make sure it's clear. You have to dry fire the weapon to release the sear from the striker, and once you do that, you can take the tension off of these two levers here by pulling the slide back slightly. Pull the levers down and the slide will move forward off of the frame. Now the slide is typical of most of your striker fired semi-autos. You have a captured recoil spring, and it is a steel guide rod. You have the barrel, and one thing I want to look at is the quality of the machining. I had heard a lot of complaints about the quality of the machining, before I bought this, but the machining looks fairly well done. I don't see anything that I would complain about so far. And then you have the slide. And the slide, hopefully you guys can see this at home. I'm early in the stages of trying to develop how to do videos on YouTube, so hopefully I do fairly well. Alright, basically you have your striker. It moves in a firing pin channel. It's got the cocked indicator on the back of it. Here you have your firing pin safety. So as the trigger bar moves to the rear, it's just going to disengage that safety and allow the firing pin to move inside the firing pin channel. And basically right now the firing pin cannot come through, and when the trigger bar releases that safety, the firing pin can then come through through the breech face and fire the cartridge. So again, there's your firing pin safety. With the trigger bar in the neutral position, the firing pin cannot move forward. Now, this right here, this cam is what releases, or I shouldn't say it releases, it depresses the trigger bar and disengages the trigger bar from the connector, allowing it to reset. So this cam in a minute will be very important. Alright, everything else on the slide looks good. Now, inside the frame, this acts like a drop safety. The reason these triggers within a trigger are present in these firearms is because of the weight of the trigger bar assembly and the trigger. If it did not have this drop safety, from the inertia, from just dropping the gun, the weight of that trigger bar assembly would depress itself, fire the gun. This is a spring-loaded safety that operates off of this compression spring right here. So as I engage the trigger, you can see how the safety moves under the weight of the spring. So that spring keeps this safety out, and when you drop the weapon, it will not let the trigger bar move to the rear, firing the weapon. This cam disengages the firing pin safety. This cam runs across the cam I showed you inside the slide. So when these go together, it's like this. So this operates off of this cam. As the slide moves to the rear, it pushes down on this and it will reset the trigger bar against the connector so that it can catch the firing pin on the slide's travel forward. Now, how this works, and by the way, this is just the trigger bar spring, very similar to the way the Glock works, except being underneath the cruciform, it is beside the trigger bar. The trigger bar comes along the side of the frame, bends inward into this position right here. Now, I know you probably can't see it, but right in here, there's basically what operates like a connector. It engages both the sear for the striker and it operates off of the trigger bar. As I squeeze the trigger bar to the rear, you can just see that it travels. Now the way this works is on a Glock, the trigger bar engages the firing pin itself. And that is why as you squeeze the trigger to the rear, it's so spongy. It picks up that firing pin and starts moving it to the rear, and then the connector pulls the trigger bar or the cruciform down and it slips off of the connector or off of the firing pin and allows the firing pin to travel forward. The slide then moves to the rear, activates the connector, resets the trigger bar, the cruciform catches the firing pin as the slide moves forward. On this pistol, the trigger bar is independent of cocking the striker mechanism. In the travel to the rear, the trigger bar does nothing about cocking the firearm or fully engaging tension on the striker. What happens is the striker is engaged on this, which I'll call a sear. This sear holds the trigger bar, this sear holds the firing pin from moving forward. When it's in this position here, the firing pin would be pressed against this face of the sear. Now the disconnector is at the bottom and it holds it from going any farther down. As I slide the trigger to the rear, as I squeeze the trigger to the rear, watch what happens to the sear. It will drop down a little bit, and that releases the firing pin, and the firing pin moves forward firing the weapon. Now, when the slide moves to the rear, the cam moves across this part of the trigger bar, pushes it down, it resets it. As the slide comes back into position, the striker, the tab on the striker engages your sear, pushes it down, and it only goes down that far. Now, as you release the trigger, it resets the trigger bar against the connector. The next shot only releases the firing pin firing the weapon again. It'll cycle, reset the trigger, reset the connector, and the sear catches the firing pin again. As you release the trigger, resets the trigger bar and the connector. When you release your finger from the trigger, it does nothing to take any tension off the firing pin, so that your next shot, as you squeeze the first shot, say of your next string, as you squeeze the trigger back, that motion does nothing. It has no resistance other than the trigger bar spring. Until you engage the side of the connector, squeeze a little bit more, releases the sear, and fires the weapon again. I know it's a little confusing. I use some words incorrectly, but if you have questions, leave them in the comments and I'll do a specific video just on the function of the trigger. The way they have this trigger set up is why it feels like shooting, say, like a 1911 single action trigger. It's a very clean, crisp trigger. There's very little reset. There's no take-up. There's no variable take-up tension on it. It's just a consistent squeeze against this spring until you're ready to release the firing mechanism, firing the gun. So again, I'll go more into that if people want me to. You have an extended slide release. The only thing in functioning the gun I've noticed is I wish they would have made this extended slide release more the length of the slide release and not just in the front. It would be much, I can hit it here, but it would be much easier if it were back a little bit farther. The feel of the gun is great. I love the contour of it, the undercut, everything is very comfortable. I love the fact it has no finger grooves. My hands never seem to fit finger grooves very well. This one is very, very comfortable. So I will put it back together and we'll fire a few shots. The barrel just returns back into the slide. Push it forward. Your captured recoil spring assembly fits into the front, and you'll see there's like a half moon cut here, and that is where the edge of the firing pin guide rod will go, is actually into this groove. And make sure that you don't set it against the barrel lug right here. There will be a gap between the barrel lug and the face of the guide rod. To reassemble it, you just return the slide back into the slide rails, pull it all the way back, it's captured, check your trigger and your action work correctly, which it does. Now one thing I want to show you is the trigger on this. So this initial take-up has nothing to do with fully cocking the mechanism, the firing mechanism. You can see here this is a striker cocked indicator, and as I squeeze the trigger back, it does nothing to farther pull that back or to fully cock it. Now this is, an SF model. The DA model is different. So now when I go to fire the first shot, I squeeze the trigger. That's all my take up. I'm against the wall now, and it just takes a slight movement to the rear. That would fire the weapon. The slide would cycle, return back into battery. The trigger bar has been depressed, the connectors reset, the sear reset. You can see here it captured the firing pin. It is fully cocked. My second shot is just releasing the trigger from here to there, and I can fire my next shot. Then it will fully release. And again, that take-up has nothing to do with cocking the firing pin. It's just take up in the spring and the trigger bar, and then at the back of the travel where the trigger bar is against the connector just releases the sear, releasing the firing pin, firing the weapon. Okay, so we will get on with shooting the pistol now. Hi, I'm back to cover the slide guide rails. I didn't mention those before. The locking block is embedded in the polymer, and it's fashioned a little bit differently than a Glock would be. I haven't taken it apart yet to see exactly how it fits into the frame, but you can see here there's a pin here that's the trigger pin, and it passes through the locking block just like a Glock does, and then there's a forward area that is open on one side, and it's embedded into the polymer on both sides, and that will aid in securing the locking block to the frame. The guide rails for the slide, the slide rails are embedded in the polymer. And I have a friend with an X-ray machine, and I'm going to see if we can get an X-ray in the future on polymer guns of how far the rails are embedded into them and what they look like. So we'll see if we can work on that. You have a machined, it looks to be machined ejector, and then you also have your takedown lever is connected to this detent right here. So when you pull both sides of that slide release down, that releases the slide off of the frame. It's just pulling this detent out of the way and allows the slide to move forward. And the reason you have to dry fire it is to release the sear from the firing pin. So once the sear is released and this detent is pulled down and released, the slide will move forward. Okay, so sorry I missed those things in the previous segment. Now we'll get on with firing the weapon.